The desert sun poured down like a merciless fire, burning the sands into waves of heat that danced in the air. The Nile shimmered in the distance, a lifeline that cut through the endless gold of the land, feeding the people and fueling their grandest vision. Rising above the desert, half-finished yet already monumental, stood the structure that would one day become a pyramid, a mountain of stone shaped by human hands. The scale was beyond comprehension, its sides already gleaming in the sun as if touched by the gods themselves. To stand near it was to feel small, as if the earth itself was reshaping under the will of men. Around the massive site, a symphony of human labor unfolded. Thousands of workers moved in waves, their bodies shining with sweat, their muscles taut from endless exertion. Some hauled ropes as thick as a man's arm, pulling sledges that groaned under the weight of limestone blocks heavier than cattle. Others carried water and clay jars from the Nile, pouring it carefully onto the sand to soften the ground beneath the sledges. The mixture of wet and dry sand created a strange miracle. What once resisted movement now allowed the blocks to glide more easily, the grit binding together and reducing the drag. Cries of effort echoed, chants rose to keep the rhythm of pulling, and overseers barked commands in sharp voices that cracked through the heat like whips. The air was filled with dust, a fine white cloud kicked up by the shifting stones and the relentless footsteps of men and donkeys alike. It coated the workers' skin until they looked like statues themselves, carved from pale rock. The scent of sweat, damp earth, and hot limestone mixed into a heavy perfume that clung to the throat. Yet, despite the agony in their muscles and the pain in their blistered hands, the workers pressed on, driven by the promise of rations of bread, onions, and beer, and the knowledge that they were part of something far greater than themselves. Above the chaos, the engineers stood on wooden scaffolds, their eyes sharp, their minds sharper. They wore simple linen robes but carried an authority that silenced even the overseers. In their hands were scrolls of papyrus marked with lines and numbers, calculations that mapped out every angle, every stone, every placement. They were the keepers of geometry, guardians of the secrets passed down from earlier generations who had raised temples and shrines. With strings, plumb bobs, and measuring rods, they checked alignments constantly, ensuring that the growing structure pointed exactly toward the cardinal directions, its sides meeting with mathematical precision. To them, this was not merely labor, it was the execution of a divine equation. One engineer lifted his staff and shouted an order. The ropes tightened, men leaned forward with gritted teeth, and slowly, almost painfully, a massive block began to ascend the ramp. The ramp stretched like veins across the construction site, built of mud brick and rubble, layered in a spiral that wound around the pyramid's rising body. Each block moved inch by inch, dragged upward by sheer human strength, the sledges creaking and groaning as though the stone itself resisted. At intervals, other workers jammed logs under the sledges, rolling them forward before pulling the logs free again, repeating the cycle with a rhythm that had become second nature. The desert echoed with grunts, with the sound of ropes tightening and wood snapping under pressure, with the faint hum of chants designed to steady the will of exhausted men. From a distance, the scene was mesmerizing. It looked like a colony of ants swarming over a mountain, each carrying a fragment of stone to create something immense. Yet every movement was guided by purpose. The overseers stalked the ramps with whips in hand. Though rarely did they strike, the side of authority was often enough to keep the workers moving. The real force lay not in cruelty but in the system itself, a design so meticulous that even chaos seemed orderly. Stones arrived from the quarries across the Nile, ferried on wooden boats, then dragged by teams of oxen to the site, where human chains hauled them into position. Every task was interconnected, every role essential, every person bound into the rhythm of progress. The heat was punishing. The sun hammered down until even the sand seemed to burn, and men's sandals grew hot beneath their feet. Sweat poured from their bodies in rivers, soaking linen kilts and dripping into the dust. Some fainted and were carried to shaded tents where water was poured over their heads. Others pressed on, ignoring their own exhaustion, caught up in the chants that rose like a heartbeat, a deep, pulsing sound that gave them unity, as though the work itself was a prayer. And in many ways, it was, for they believed they were not just building for a man, but for eternity. The pharaoh was seen as a living god, and this pyramid was to be his stairway to the heavens, a vessel to carry his soul to the stars. To work on it was to serve the divine, and so even the poorest laborer could find pride in his suffering. Children too young to pull ropes ran errands, carrying water skins and small tools to the workers. Women cooked bread in simple clay ovens near the workers' village, the smell wafting toward the site whenever the wind shifted. Life had formed around the pyramid, a temporary city buzzing with energy, with families, laughter, and stories told by firelight at night. But as the sun rose each morning, the city emptied toward a growing monument, drawn like worshippers to a temple of stone. The pyramid itself loomed larger with each passing week, a shape so perfect it seemed unnatural. Already its sides angled with eerie precision, casting shadows that marked the hours like a colossal sundial. At the base, blocks fit together so tinily that even a knife blade could not slide between them, each placement guided by the engineer's relentless insistence on perfection. Higher up, scaffolds creaked as men hammered wooden wedges to hold stones in place while the mortar dried. Every sound was a note in the symphony of creation. As the day stretched into late afternoon, the heat began to soften, the sky shifted from blinding blue to the warm gold of evening. The workers' chants grew weaker, their movements slower, but the engineers pressed them for just one more block, one more haul up the ramp before the sun dipped. With a final shout, ropes strained and the last stone of the day slid into its place, thudding onto the layer beneath with a deep, satisfying sound. A cheer rose from the men, weak but genuine, and even the overseers allowed themselves a small smile. The pyramid stood a little taller now, reaching further into the sky. The workers collapsed onto the ground, some drinking greedily from jars of water, others lying flat, staring up at the structure they had helped raise. Their bodies were broken, but their spirits carried a strange pride. They knew they were part of something that would outlast them all, something that might stand for thousands of years. The engineers rolled up their scrolls, satisfied that the day's calculations had proven true. As the sun finally sank, the pyramid glowed with the light of dusk, its edges burning red and gold against the horizon. In that moment, it seemed less a human creation and more a bridge between worlds, a monument that tied earth to sky. And though the desert wind whispered indifferently across the sands, every soul present knew they were building not just for a pharaoh, but for history itself.